There was a place in the Atlantic Ocean where German U-boats ruled completely. No Allied planes could reach it. No ships dared enter without fear. For years, it was a killing zone where submarines operated with total immunity. The Allies called it the air gap. And by 1943, it had become the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. But then something changed. The hunters became the hunted. And dozens of U-boats that entered this zone, expecting easy kills, never surfaced again. This is the story of how the air gap went from being the safest place for German submarines to becoming their graveyard. To understand what happened, you need to know what the air gap actually was. Picture the Atlantic Ocean in 1942. The Allies had aircraft patrolling from both sides. Planes from Britain could cover the eastern Atlantic. Planes from Canada and Iceland could patrol the west. But right in the middle, there was this massive gap, about 600 miles across, way too far for any plane to reach and still have fuel to get back. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. This was a disaster, because German U-boats knew about it, and they used it ruthlessly. See, U-boats had this massive weakness. They were actually pretty vulnerable on the surface. Slow, can't dive quickly, basically sitting ducks if a plane spotted them. But underwater, different story. They could hide, they could attack, they were deadly. The problem was, they couldn't stay underwater forever. They needed to surface, to recharge batteries, get fresh air, and most importantly, they could move way faster on the surface. A U-boat underwater could do maybe 7 or 8 knots. On the surface, 17 knots, more than double. So the German strategy was simple. Surface in the air gap where no planes could reach you, race across at full speed, hunt Allied convoys without fear, then dive only when you absolutely had to. And it worked. God, did it work. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. That's more than 1,000 ships. Think about that. 1,000 ships, each one loaded with supplies, weapons, food, oil. Some had troops, all of them had crews. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Badly. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war. Not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion, the submarines. Because here's what was happening. Britain was an island. Everything it needed came by ship. Food, fuel, ammunition, everything. And the U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build new ones. Do the math on that. If you're losing ships faster than you can replace them, eventually you run out of ships. No ships means no supplies. No supplies means Britain starves. Britain starves. Britain surrenders. Germany didn't need to invade. They just needed to keep sinking ships in the air gap. And the worst part? The Allies knew exactly where the U-boats were operating. They could track the attack patterns. They could see the gap in their air coverage. They just couldn't do anything about it. The technology didn't exist. Planes couldn't fly that far. Simple as that. Convoy after convoy entered the air gap, knowing they were about to sail through hundreds of miles with zero air protection. The merchant sailors called it sailing into the black pit, because that's what it felt like. Sailing into darkness, knowing submarines were down there, waiting. Some convoys lost half their ships crossing the gap. Some lost more. The crews could see it happening around them. A ship would explode in the middle of the night. Torpedoed. Sometimes it would sink in minutes. Sometimes the crew had time to abandon ship. Sometimes they didn't. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. But in early 1943, something started changing. It began with a plane most people have never heard of, the VLR Liberator. VLR stood for Very Long Range. The Allies took B-24, Liberator bombers, and stripped everything out that wasn't absolutely essential. Extra guns? Gone. Armor plating? Gone. Bomb bay? Filled with fuel tanks instead. These planes were ugly, uncomfortable, and crews hated flying them on 10-hour patrols over empty ocean. But they could do something no other aircraft could. They could reach the middle of the air gap, just barely. With perfect conditions and careful fuel management, a VLR Liberator could patrol the center of the Atlantic for about 30 minutes before having to turn back. 30 minutes doesn't sound like much, but it was enough. The first VLR patrol over the air gap happened in March 1943. The U-boat commanders had no idea these planes even existed. Imagine you're a U-boat captain. For months, you've been surfacing in the air gap with complete confidence. You know the patrol ranges. You know you're safe. You've done this 100 times. You surface. Your crew comes up to get fresh air. The diesel engines roar to life. You're making good speed. 17 knots, racing toward the next convoy. And then someone screams, "Aircraft!" That's not supposed to happen. That can't happen. You're in the middle of the air gap. There are no planes here. That's the whole point. But there it is, a Liberator, coming in low and fast. Now you've got maybe 60 seconds to crash dive. Get your crew below, seal the hatches, flood the ballast tanks, get under before that plane reaches you. Except 60 seconds isn't enough, not even close. The Liberator drops depth charges. Even if you get under, if you're not deep enough, those charges will rip your submarine apart. The pressure waves alone can buckle your hull. This started happening more and more. U-boats that thought they were safe suddenly getting attacked from the air. Some got sunk immediately, others got damaged badly enough they had to limp back to base. But here's the thing. The Allies didn't have many VLR Liberators at first. Maybe 20 or 30, covering the entire Atlantic. The air gap was huge. The chances of a U-boat running into one of these planes were still pretty low. The German commanders knew the planes existed, but they gambled that the odds were in their favor. Keep surfacing in the gap. Keep moving fast. Accept that occasionally you might get unlucky. That was a fatal mistake, because the VLR Liberators were just the beginning. The Allies were developing new technology so fast the Germans couldn't keep up. Every month, something new appeared that made the air gap more dangerous. Centimetric radar. This was huge. Older radar systems used longer wavelengths that U-boats could detect. They'd pick up the radar signal and dive before the plane got close. The new radar used 10-centimeter wavelengths. The U-boat's detection equipment couldn't see it. The first time a U-boat knew a radar-equipped plane was nearby was when the depth charges started falling. Then there was the lee light. Picture this. It's night. You're a U-boat running on the surface under cover of darkness. You think you're invisible. A Liberator picks you up on radar from miles away. It comes in low, staying dark. When it's about a mile out, it flips on this massive searchlight. Suddenly you're lit up like it's daytime. You're blinded. Your crew is scrambling. You're trying to crash dive, and the plane has a perfect visual on you as it lines up its attack run. The Germans didn't have an answer for this. They tried different things. Some U-boats started carrying more anti-aircraft guns. The thinking was, if you can't dive in time, maybe you can shoot down the plane. That worked exactly once. One U-boat managed to shoot down a Liberator. But, in the process, they stayed on the surface way too long and got sunk by the next plane that showed up. Other U-boats tried staying submerged longer, only surfacing at night and only when absolutely necessary. But that meant moving slower, way slower. A convoy could outrun you if you were underwater. The Germans were trapped in an impossible situation. Surface and risk getting attacked from the air. Stay submerged and become ineffective. May 1943. That's when everything fell apart for the U-boats. The Allies called it Black May. The Germans called it something unprintable. 41 U-boats sank in 1 month. 41. That's more than one per day. Put yourself in the position of a U-boat crew. You're in your early 20s probably. You've trained for months. You know your submarine. inside and out. You trust your captain, you trust your crew, and you know the statistics. 75% of U-boat crew members died during the war. 3 out of every 4. Those are your odds. You sail out anyway, because you're military, because it's war, because you don't really think you'll be the one who doesn't come back. The boat leaves port. Your family waves goodbye. Your mother is crying but trying to hide it. Your girlfriend promises to wait for you. You sail into the Atlantic. You enter the air gap, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you're wondering if this is the trip you don't come back from. The psychological pressure was insane. You're in a steel tube underwater. It's cramped, it's humid, it smells terrible. You can't shower, you can't get away from the other 49 men crammed in there with you. The air is stale. Everything is damp. And any second, a depth charge could detonate next to your hull and kill everyone instantly. Or worse. Not kill everyone instantly. Some U-boats got damaged by depth charges but didn't sink immediately. The hull would crack. Water would start flooding in. The crew would try to surface, but the diving planes are jammed or the ballast tanks are ruptured. You're stuck underwater in a flooding submarine. The water is rising. It's pitch black. People are screaming. The air is running out. That's how a lot of U-boat crews died. Trapped in the dark, drowning slowly, knowing there's no way out. Let me tell you about U-boat 954. It was commanded by Odo Lowe. He was experienced, competent, had survived multiple patrols. April 19th, 1943, he's running on the surface in the air gap. Perfect weather, clear skies. A liberator spots him on radar. Lowe's crew doesn't detect anything until the plane is already close. They try to crash dive. They almost make it. The liberator drops 4 depth charges. One of them detonates right as the submarine is going under. The explosion ruptures the pressure hull. U-954 goes down fast. Lowe and his entire crew, all 49 men, die within minutes. The liberator crew circles overhead and watches oil and debris come to the surface. That's all that's left. Pieces of wood, some clothing, oil slick spreading out. 49 families back in Germany are about to get telegrams. Or consider U-710. May 24th, 1943. Kapitänleutnant Dietrich von Karlowitz commanding. A Catalina flying boat picks them up on radar. The U-boat tries to dive. The Catalina drops depth charges. But here's the thing. The attack doesn't sink the submarine immediately. It damages it. Badly. U-710 can't dive properly anymore. Can't stay submerged. It's forced to surface. Karlowitz knows he's done. The submarine is dying. He orders the crew to abandon ship. They're going to scuttle it and take their chances in the water. But they're hundreds of miles from land. The water is freezing. The Catalina is radiating their position. So maybe a ship will come pick them up. Maybe. The crew gets into life rafts. They watch their submarine sink. And then they wait. No one came. The entire crew died of exposure in the North Atlantic. 46 more families getting telegrams. This was happening over and over. The air gap had become a death trap. Admiral Karl Dönitz was in charge of the U-boat fleet. He'd been a U-boat commander himself in World War I. He understood submarines. He'd built the entire German U-boat strategy. And by May 1943, his strategy was failing catastrophically. He had a decision to make. Keep sending U-boats into the air gap and watch them get slaughtered, or withdraw them temporarily, regroup, and try to find a solution. On May 24th, he ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. This was massive. This was essentially admitting defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. The whole point of the U-boat campaign was to cut Britain's supply lines. If the U-boats couldn't operate in the Atlantic, that mission was over. Dönitz's staff tried developing countermeasures. They experimented with coating submarines in radar-absorbent material. Didn't work well enough. They developed a device called the snorkel. It was basically a snorkel that let the submarine run its diesel engines while submerged. You could cruise at periscope depth without having to fully surface. That helped. A little. But submarines with snorkels were still slow, still vulnerable, still getting sunk. The fundamental problem was that the air gap had closed. The technology had caught up. There was no longer anywhere in the Atlantic that was safe for a U-boat to surface. But the Germans didn't give up. Some U-boats kept operating in the Atlantic even after May, either because they were already on patrol when the withdrawal order came, or because Donitz sent small groups back out to try new tactics. Every single one of those late patrols into the air gap was basically a suicide mission. U-boat 468, Captain Lieutenant Clemens Chamon commanding, entered the air gap in August 1943. A Liberator caught them surfaced. Chamon tried to fight back with anti-aircraft guns instead of diving. Bad call. The Liberator dropped depth charges while the U-boat's gunners were trying to shoot it down. Direct hit. U-468 broke apart on the surface. Some of the crew survived the initial explosion. They were in the water, screaming for help, watching pieces of their submarine sink around them. The Liberator couldn't do anything for them. It radioed their position, but by the time help arrived, everyone had died from hypothermia. 51 more telegrams. U-boat 466, November 1943. A Liberator caught it surfaced in what used to be the air gap. This time, the U-boat managed to dive just before the depth charges hit. The explosions damaged, but didn't sink the submarine. For the crew, that was almost worse. They were stuck underwater with failing systems. The hull was leaking in multiple places. The batteries were damaged and giving off chlorine gas. The captain tried to surface, but the diving planes weren't responding properly. They managed to get to the surface eventually, but by then, more planes had arrived. The crew abandoned ship. The U-boat sank. 49 men ended up in the water. Only 7 survived long enough to be picked up. This kept happening. U-boat after U-boat entering the zone that used to be safe and getting destroyed. Let's talk about what this meant in cold, hard numbers. In 1942, before the air gap closed, the U-boats were winning. They sank 1,664 Allied ships. That's 7.8 million tons of shipping. The Allies built new ships, but not fast enough to replace those losses. In 1943, after the air gap closed, the equation flipped completely. The Allies sank 237 U-boats that year. The Germans built new ones, but not fast enough to replace those losses. By 1944, it was a slaughter. Allied aircraft and ships were hunting U-boats almost unopposed. The submarines that did try to operate in the Atlantic were using snorkels, staying submerged constantly, barely effective. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. The Allies had won. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, about 30,000 died. That's a 75% casualty rate. 3 out of 4. That's not a military campaign. That's annihilation. Think about those men. Most of them were in their 20s. They joined up thinking they were going to be heroes, the elite of the Kriegsmarine, the hunters of the Atlantic. Instead, they climbed into steel coffins and sailed into the air gap. And most of them never came back. Here's what closing the air gap actually meant for the war. Without U-boats threatening the Atlantic supply lines, the Allies could move troops and supplies to Britain without major losses. That made D-Day possible. You can't invade France if you can't get your soldiers across the ocean. The shipbuilding capacity that had been going to replace merchant ships. That got redirected to building landing craft, tankers, and supply ships for the invasion. The aircraft that had been patrolling the Atlantic. Many of them got reassigned to support ground operations in Europe. Closing the air gap didn't just win the Battle of the Atlantic. It unlocked the entire Allied strategy for winning the war in Europe. And it happened because of a few technological advances. Better planes, better radar, better tactics. The Germans never really caught up. They developed some advanced U-boat designs late in the war. Type Bunty-wing submarines that were genuinely revolutionary, could cruise underwater at high speed for long periods, would have been incredibly dangerous. But they came too late. By the time the Type Bunty-wing was ready for combat, Germany was already collapsing. Most of them never left port. I want you to think about what it was like for the families. You're a mother in Hamburg. Your son is a Maschinenmat, an engine room mechanic, on U-boat 954. He's 22 years old. He left on patrol 6 weeks ago. You haven't heard anything since. You're not supposed to. Radio silence is standard procedure. Then someone knocks on your door. You know what that means. Everyone knows what that means. It's a telegram. It says, your son's submarine is missing and presumed lost. There's some formal language about him dying heroically for the fatherland. But there are no details. Because there are no survivors. No one knows exactly what happened. The submarine just disappeared somewhere in the Atlantic. You don't know if he died instantly or if he was trapped underwater, drowning in the dark. You don't know if he suffered. You'll never know. There's no body to bury, no grave to visit, just a name that might someday show up on a memorial. This happened to thousands of families, thousands of telegrams delivered, thousands of young men who sailed into the air gap and never came home. And most of them died in the span of about 2 years, 1943 to 1945. That's how fast the air gap went from being the safest place for U-boats to being where they all went to die. Even knowing the odds, U-boats kept sailing until the very end of the war. U-boat 1206, April 1945. Yes, April 1945. 2 weeks before Germany surrendered. This U-boat didn't even get sunk by the enemy. The captain, Kapitän Lieutenant Karl Adolf Schlitt, was trying out the boat's new high-tech toilet system. He flushed it wrong. I'm not making this up. The toilet malfunction caused seawater to flood into the submarine. This created chlorine gas when the seawater mixed with the battery acid. The boat was forced to surface. British aircraft spotted them immediately. Schlitt had to abandon ship. 4 crew members died. The rest became prisoners of war. A U-boat destroyed by its own toilet in the final days of the war. After everything that had happened in the air gap, after all the technological advances and tactical changes and thousands of deaths, that's how U-1206 went down. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. The last U-boat sunk in action was U-320, May 7th, 1945, the day before Germany surrendered. A British frigate got it with depth charges in the North Sea. All 55 crew members died. The war ended literally the next day. Think about being on that submarine. It's May 1945. Everyone knows Germany is finished. The Allies are in Berlin. It's over. And you're still out there, still on patrol, still following orders. And then a depth charge detonates next to your hull, and you have about 30 seconds to realize you're going to die in a war that's already lost. That was the last crew to die in a U-boat. 55 men who almost made it to the end. Some U-boat crews did survive the war. About 10,000 men. They spent the rest of their lives dealing with what they'd been through. The claustrophobia. The nightmares. The survivor's guilt. Why did I make it when 3/4 of us didn't? Many of them never talked about their experiences. They came home, tried to rebuild their lives, tried to forget. But you can't forget something like that. You can't forget months spent in a steel tube underwater, listening to depth charges exploding around you, watching your friends die, knowing that any day could be the day you don't surface again. One survivor, Herbert Werner, wrote a book about his experiences decades later. He'd served on U-boats throughout the war. He described the constant fear, the way you could never relax, the way every strange sound might be a destroyer's propeller getting closer. He talked about the men who broke mentally, the ones who started crying and couldn't stop, the ones who became catatonic, the ones who cracked completely and had to be sedated. There was nowhere to send them. You can't evacuate someone from a submarine in the middle of the Atlantic. They stayed aboard until the patrol was over, locked in their bunk, sedated, while the rest of the crew tried to function around them. Werner survived, but he carried those experiences for the rest of his life. All the survivors did. The U-boats that sank in the air gap are still down there. Most of them are in deep water, 3 miles down, 4 miles down. It's pitch black at that depth. The pressure is enormous. Nothing human can reach them. They're just sitting on the ocean floor, still sealed. The crew's still inside. Some of the submarines are in shallower water. Divers have reached a few of them. The ones they've explored are haunting. Everything is preserved. The cold water and lack of oxygen means things don't decay the way they would on land. Coffee cups still sitting on tables. Photographs of girlfriends and wives. Letters half written. Boots lined up. Clothes hanging. And bones. The remains of the crews. These are war graves now. Most countries have laws protecting them. You're not supposed to disturb them or remove anything, but they're down there. Dozens of them scattered across what used to be the air gap. Each one a time capsule from the worst days of the Battle of the Atlantic. Each one containing the remains of 40 or 50 young men who thought they were sailing into the safest part of the ocean. So, what's the lesson here? Technology changes warfare faster than anyone expects. The air gap existed because aircraft couldn't fly far enough. That seemed like a permanent limitation. It wasn't. Within a year, the Allies developed planes that could reach the gap, then radar that couldn't be detected, then searchlights for night hunting. The technology evolved so fast the Germans couldn't adapt. And suddenly the safest place in the Atlantic became the most dangerous. But there's a human lesson too. Thousands of young men climbed into U-boats knowing the statistics, knowing most of them wouldn't come back. They did it anyway. Some did it because they believed in what they were fighting for. Some did it because they didn't have a choice. Some did it because their friends were doing it, and they didn't want to be the one who refused. And most of them died, drowned in the dark, crushed by pressure, blown apart by depth charges. They didn't die storming beaches or charging machine gun nests. They died in sealed metal tubes at the bottom of the ocean. No witnesses, no glory, just gone. The families never got real answers about what happened, just missing and presumed lost. That's what the air gap was, a place where thousands of men went to die, where their families never got closure, where whole submarines just vanished and were never seen again. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted from 1939 to 1945, 6 years. The Allies lost roughly 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships. About 72,000 Allied sailors and merchant mariners died. The Germans lost 783 U-boats out of about 1,150 built. About 30,000 U-boat crew members died. Another 5,000 became prisoners of war. If you were in a U-boat crew, you had a 1 in 4 chance of surviving the war. Those are the worst odds of any military branch in any country during World War II. And a huge percentage of those losses happened in or around the air gap in 1943 and 1944, when the zone that was supposed to be safe became a killing ground. The wrecks are still down there. The men are still in them. And every single one of those submarines has a story. A crew that sailed out expecting to come back. Families waiting for them. Letters that were never finished. Plans that never happened. All of it ended in the dark, in the cold, at the bottom of the Atlantic. The air gap doesn't exist anymore. Modern aircraft can cross the Atlantic easily. Satellites can track submarines anywhere in the ocean. But for a few years in the 1940s, there was this zone in the middle of the Atlantic where the rules were different, where U-boats hunted freely, where convoys sailed through in terror, and then the technology changed. The hunters became the hunted. Dozens of U-boats entered the air gap expecting to be safe. They surfaced, ran their diesels, charged their batteries, moved at full speed, and they never made it back. Their wrecks are monuments now, to technological change, to the brutality of naval warfare, to thousands of young men who died in steel coffins at the bottom of the sea. The air gap claimed more submarines in 2 years than most naval battles claim in entire wars. And most people have never heard of it. But the families remember, the survivors remember, and the ocean remembers. The wrecks are still down there. They'll be down there long after everyone who remembers the Battle of the Atlantic is gone. That's the story of the air gap. That's what happened when U-boats entered the one place they thought they were safe and never came back.